Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Zevachim, which is not only an introduction to Masechet Zevachim, but also an introduction to Seder Kodashim as a whole. We're beginning a new Seder Kodashim, the order of holy things, and this order deals with the sacrifices brought in the temple. So we're entering a new world. Of course, we've encountered sacrifices before throughout the Masechtot that we've learned before. But now we're going to be focusing for an entire order for the next year and a half on sacrifices. And if you're feeling a little bit concerned, uncomfortable that these laws are much less familiar than the laws that we've encountered before, you're in good company. Maimonides writes in his introduction to this order that even though the laws of sacrifice are clearly defined in the Torah and are actually explicated a lot in comparison to other areas of the law, in practice, these laws have been lost since the destruction of the temple, and consequently, the study of these laws has also waned because the practical application is gone. And Maimonides says that even in his own time, this has led to a situation where even the greatest scholar and an ignorant person are on equal footing regarding the topic of sacrifices. So we'll start from the beginning, and just like the Rambam does himself, we'll try and give an introduction to the different types of sacrifices before we discuss what exactly we're going to see in Masechet Zevachim. So when we think about sacrifices as a whole, we can categorize sacrifices in various different ways. First, we can distinguish between zvachim, animal sacrifices, which come from cattle or from birds, and between menachot, which is going to be the next Masechet, grain offerings. These are sacrifices that come from plants. Another way that we could categorize sacrifices is by looking at the difference between public sacrifices versus individual sacrifices. So some offerings are public. For instance, the Korban HaTamid, the daily sacrifice that's brought every day in the temple. This is a sacrifice that's paid for by the community. And so it's considered a Korban Tzibur, a public offering. On the other hand, we have individual offerings. Some of these are offerings that we have to bring, like offerings that are brought on specific holidays or specific transgressions. Okay, so for instance, we'll talk about Korban Asham, Korban Chatat. And some of these are voluntary. So that's another way of categorizing the different sacrifices. Sacrifices that are required or mandatory versus sacrifices that are voluntary. So some sacrifices are mandated by the Torah or mandated by the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Other sacrifices are a nedava. They're offered as a gift of free will. Another classification that is important to be aware of is by the level of the sacrifice's sanctity. Here we distinguish between Kodshei Kodashim, so the holiest of the holy, and Kodashim Kalim, sacrifices that are the lesser holy. So sacrifices like Olah, a burnt offering, which is completely consumed on the altar, and Chatat and Asham, sin and guilt offerings. These three offerings are considered Kodshei Kodashim, which means that they're eaten only by the priests or entirely by the altar in the case of the Olah, and they need to be eaten in the temple courtyard, in the Azara. By contrast, Kodashim Kalim are sacrifices like Shlamim, peace offerings. In general, Kodashim Kalim tend to be more often individual offerings. And a portion of these offerings can be eaten by the owner, and they're subject to fewer restrictions. So, for example, they can be slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard, and not only in they can be slaughtered anywhere in the temple precincts, and not only in the northern part of the Azara. And in contrast to the Kodshei Kodashim, which can be eaten only in the temple courtyard in the Azara, Kodashim Kalim can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem and not just within the temple itself. So it's important to be aware of these different distinctions because at different points, the Sugya will make assumptions about what different kinds of sacrifices have in common. So we need to keep these in mind, and it's good to review it as we go along. If we think about Masechet Zevachim, so as we said at the beginning, Zvachim are animal sacrifices in contrast to Menachot, which are grain offerings. When we think about the animal sacrifices, there are actually 7 different types of animal sacrifices. We have the Kodshei Kodashim that we mentioned, so the Olah, the burnt offering, which means that it's all Olah to God. It's entirely consumed on the altar. No one eats from this sacrifice, neither the sacrificer, the owner of the sacrifice, nor the priests. The second kind of sacrifice is a chatat, a sin offering, which is brought generally to atone for an unintentional sin. The third kind of sacrifice is the asham, the guilt offering, which is brought for specific transgressions. It's brought for stealing. It's brought for misusing temple property. And then we have the Kodashim Kalim. We have the Shlamim, which is a peace offering, which, as I mentioned, is usually an individual offering. And we also have another 3 more specific kinds of Kodashim Kalim. We have the sacrifice of the Bechor, the firstborn animal. We have the Maaser Behema, an animal tithe. Every 10% of all animals born to an owner are to be sacrificed to God. And we have the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. Now, what's interesting about Masechet Zevachim is that it doesn't actually talk, we would expect that a tractate called Zvachim, animal offerings, would tell us what are all the animal offerings and when are they each brought and why, what is the reason to bring each sacrifice and at what time. But actually, Tractate Zvachim doesn't deal with the why or the when of each sacrifice, because just as we can see from the last few examples that I gave, the example, for instance, of the Bechor, the firstborn animal, is detailed in an entire tractate, Bechorot, which is dedicated to this subject. Similarly, Korban Pesach is also, most of Masechet Pesachim doesn't actually deal with Leil HaSeder and Matzah and etc., but it deals with the Passover offering. So most of the why do we bring a certain sacrifice and when do we bring a certain sacrifice is detailed in other Masechtot. If you think, for instance, about the tractate we just concluded, Horayot, that tractate talks about Korban Helem Davar. And Tractate Nazir talks about the sacrifices that the Nazirite brings. And Chagiga discusses the Shlamim and other sacrifices that are brought when someone comes to the temple 3 times a year on the 3 festivals. So those concepts have actually already been discussed in various other Masechtot throughout the Shas. And then the question is, okay, so what does Tractate Zvachim actually focus on? And Tractate Zvachim doesn't focus on the reason for bringing a sacrifice. It focuses on the how, on the procedure that's common to all sacrifices. And in fact, within the Talmud itself, and later by early commentators, this tractate wasn't called Zvachim, but rather it was called Shchitat Kodashim, the slaughtering of holy things. So that name shows us the focus on how we do things, right? On the process, on the procedure. So let's discuss the main steps of the procedure of every animal sacrifice. Every animal sacrifice has four main steps: the slaughter, shchita, receiving the blood, kabbalat hadam, receiving the blood into a vessel, carrying the blood to the altar, holachat hadam, and sprinkling the blood on the altar, zrikat hadam. The last three steps must be performed by a priest, perhaps counterintuitively to us, because when we think of bringing a sacrifice, I think what we focus on generally is on the step of the slaughter. But for the rabbis, the step of the slaughter can actually be performed by any person, even by a zal, a person who is not a priest, while steps 2, 3, 4 must be performed by a priest in order for the sacrifice to be kosher. Um, this is all regarding cattle, which needs to be shechted or slaughtered. For bird offerings, there are only two steps. The first step is the melika, which is a kind of pinching of the neck with the nail of the priest. So it's like the slaughter of the bird, and netinat adam, sprinkling the blood. Um, Sprinkling of the blood is understood as the climax of this process. So if any of the four steps, slaughter, receiving the blood, carrying the blood, or sprinkling the blood, are done improperly, the sacrifice is invalid. However, the sacrifice doesn't end with the sprinkling of the blood, right? It still needs to be handled afterwards. What happens afterwards? So most sacrifices also include srifa or haktara, burning a portion of the sacrifice on the altar. Some sacrifices can be eaten by the owner or the priest, and the olah, as we mentioned, cannot. But this handling subsequent to the sprinkling of the blood, even if it's mishandled or handled by someone who is not a priest, that no longer affects the sacrifice. Once the sprinkling of the blood has taken place, then the sacrifice has been performed correctly. Um, What's interesting to note also, and this is typical of the Mishnah and the Talmud in general, but it stands out regarding Tractate Zevachim because the Torah really describes many of the steps of the korbanot, of the sacrifices, in contrast to, let's say, if we think about, Masechet Baba Metzia or Baba Batra, it's basically an entire Masechet built around, one or two psukim. Masechet Zevachim, there's a lot of psukim, and so we would think that there would be kind of a direct continuation. But actually, the focus of the psukim of the Torah and the focus of the rabbinic material is very different, because the Torah generally describes how to perform the rituals, and it assumes that the rituals are going to take place correctly. By contrast, Masechet Zevachim focuses specifically on the cases of errors, of everything that it could and did go wrong, whether accidentally or intentionally. So there's a great focus on the de'avad, on what to do when things are wrong, when things went wrong, when the sacrifice was brought in an incorrect method, when it was brought in an incorrect time, what kinds of things can invalidate the sacrifice, what kinds of things don't invalidate the sacrifice. That's a huge part of the tractate. If we look at the structure of the tractate, we're going to see something very, very interesting. The actual laws of the sacrifices, such as where to slaughter and how to perform these various rituals, only begins from the beginning of chapter 5. What we see in chapters 1 through 4 is a huge innovation of Chazal with regard to sacrifices. Chapters 1 through 4 focus on improper thoughts that invalidate a sacrifice. So, not actions that someone could do, but specifically thoughts about changing the significance or the time or the place of the offering. And we'll say more about this in a moment. Chapters 5 through 7 deal with the actual laws of the sacrifice. For instance, where should a sacrifice be slaughtered? How do these rituals need to be performed? How exactly do you do the melika? How exactly do you do the shchita, etc.? And then chapters 8 until the end of the tractate continue to deal with zvachim, with animal sacrifices, but there isn't something that characterizes all of these chapters. They cover a miscellaneous group of laws related to kodashim, to holy things. For instance, what happens if there's a mixture between if animals that are consecrated got mixed up with non-consecrated animals. How do we deal with that? That's the subject of one chapter. The subject of another chapter is what if we have to bring two sacrifices on one day, One is a sacrifice that is brought very frequently, but the other is a sacrifice that is brought less frequently. Let's say, for instance, a sacrifice that is only brought on festivals. So, what is the hierarchy between different sacrifices? What about if there are sacrifices that are more sanctified, less sanctified? All of these are subjects that are discussed throughout the end of the tractate, and they're more specific issues than the general principles that emerge in the first half of the tractate. I want to go back to the role of thought, or machshava, as the rabbis call it. When we look at the system of sacrifices in the Bible, then the Torah describes what needs to be done, what needs to be performed. The rabbis introduced a revolutionary concept when they determined that a key feature of the laws of sacrifice is that not only the action, but also the thought that is carried, that is being thought by the sacrificer is crucial to the sacrifice. So the person performing the sacrifice has to be careful about their intent throughout the process of the sacrifice. The first Mishnah states that if a sacrifice is slaughtered shelo lishma, not for its own sake, meaning not with the correct intent. Not, let's say I'm bringing now a korban olah, but in my mind I got mixed up and I think I'm bringing a korban shlamim. Okay, so the first Mishnah says that this sacrifice will be valid. Okay, it's not pasul, but I don't feel it doesn't fulfill the owner's obligation. So the very first Mishnah is describing this idea of lishma, of the special thought or intention that needs to be applied in order for the sacrifice to be a kosher sacrifice. This concept is actually similar to lishma that we've already seen in a completely different area of law, in the area of gitin, right? A bill of divorce has to be written with a specific woman in mind, and that is the idea of lishma begitin. If a person, a scribe, let's say, wrote a get for a certain woman named Sarah Levi, and then that couple decided not to get divorced, the scribe can't use that same get for a different couple where the wife's name is also Sarah Levi, okay? Because he has to have the intent of the specific Sarah Levi in mind when he writes the bill of divorce. Similarly, when a sacrifice is performed, the priest also has to have the specific type of the sacrifice in mind, and not only the specific type of the sacrifice. The end of this unit, in the very last Mishnah of chapter 4, Mishnah 4:6, lists 6 different thoughts that the priest has to have in mind when he brings a sacrifice. So it's the type of the sacrifice, who exactly is the owner. It has to be that it's a sacrifice that's brought for God's name. It has to be a sacrifice for a certain fragrance. So there's a whole list there of the intentions or the thoughts that need to be in the priest's mind. So it's something quite complicated, right? To not be distracted and to hold in mind throughout the sacrificial process all these different thoughts. Um, the rabbis also transform through this idea of thought a concept that is already found in the Bible. So previously I said that the idea of thought in general in korbanot is something that's not found in the Torah, and the rabbis innovate this idea of thought. But the rabbis also take a concept that is already brought in the Torah with regard to korbanot and transform that as well within the context of mental activity. And that concept is the concept of pigul. Pigul can be translated as an abomination. The Torah discusses pigul in the context of a sacrifice that wasn't eaten at the right time. So some sacrifices are to be eaten within a day after they've been sacrificed. Some sacrifices are to be eaten within 2 days after they've been sacrifices. And the Torah says that a sacrifice that wasn't eaten within that time frame becomes a pigul, and this is punishable by karet, by extirpation. However, the rabbis reinterpret the idea of pigul, and they reinterpret it through the idea of thought. The rabbis say that a sacrifice becomes pigul not when the time for eating passes, right, which is after the whole four-step process, sacrificial process has been completed. Instead, the rabbis say that a sacrifice becomes pigul at the time of the offering itself, during the four sacrificial steps. If the priest has a thought to eat the meat or burn the parts on the altar after the designated time. Okay, so it's not about eating after the designated time. It's about the priest during the sacrificial process having the thought about eating after the designated time. But the rabbis still preserve the idea of also a sacrifice that was offered correctly but wasn't eaten on time, which in the Torah is called a pigul. The rabbis give it a new name and they call it notar, the leftover sacrifice. And this sacrifice is also forbidden to eat, but it doesn't invalidate the offering and it doesn't bring about karet, so it's considered less severe than pigul. So the rabbis also sometimes call a pigul machshevet chutz lizmano, a, a sacrifice for which the thought was to offer it outside of its time or past its time. And the rabbis take this idea, and just as they have this idea about thought in time, they also apply the idea of thought to space. And they innovate another category called machshevet chutz limkomo, the thought of eating in the wrong place. So each sacrifice, as we already mentioned, has a designated area for consumption, either the entire temple courtyard or all of Jerusalem. And a thought to eat outside of this area invalidates the sacrifice. However, this thought is considered less severe than the thought of eating at the wrong time, and therefore, a person who eats a sacrifice with machshevet chutz limkomo, the thought of eating in the wrong place, isn't subject to the most severe punishment of karet as someone who eats a sacrifice of a pigul, machshevet chutz lizmano. So we can see here that it's very, there's many new ideas here, right? The whole system of sacrifices you have to have all of these ideas kind of held together. The rabbis are innovating here many different ideas that they're developing from the psukim of the Torah. We'll see in general throughout Seder Kodashim a lot of midrash halacha, a lot of deriving the laws directly from the psukim, because as I said, there's a lot of material in these psukim, but there's also a lot of innovation, and specifically this idea that some scholars have called the mental revolution, right? That just as we saw the idea of kavanah in other areas of law, of kavanah b'mitzvot or kavanah b'nizikin, now we have the role of thought, which is a huge innovation of the rabbis and really shifts the focus of the sacrifice to take place in two different planes. It's not only in the plane of action, but simultaneously we have to consider all the time both the plane of action and the plane of thought or intention. Good luck and enjoy this new and fascinating Masechet.